Welcome back to the deep dive. Have you ever found yourself listening to experts talk about politics, maybe on the news or reading different analyses, and thought, hang on, they're looking at the exact same thing, but they're seeing totally different issues?
Hmm. Happens all the time.
Or maybe you've wondered how studying something as, well, messy and human as politics can sometimes try to be like a science.
Right, with models and methods and all that.
Exactly. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into really the fundamental question of how we even begin to study politics. Because it turns out the way we decide to approach it, the questions we ask, the kind of evidence we look for, it massively shapes the answers we get.
It absolutely does. The lens matters.
Think of these as different lenses, yeah. And today, we're basically unpacking the political science lens kit.
A good way to frame it.
So this deep dive is based on a range of source material that explores these various approaches, the different ways scholars and thinkers have tried to make sense of the political world over time.
From the classical thinkers right up to contemporary methods.
Our mission, well, it's to unpack these different lenses, figure out what each one really focuses on, understand the tools they use, their methods, and crucially, see what they reveal about politics. And maybe, just maybe, what they tend to miss or leave in the shadows.
Which is just as important.
And as always, we have our resident expert here to guide us through this sometimes confusing landscape of political inquiry. And look, this isn't just dry academic stuff. Understanding these approaches is genuinely your shortcut to making better sense of the conflicting political analyses and information you run into every single day.
Absolutely. It helps you decode what you're hearing.
Okay, let's dive in then. The source material kicks off with something really crucial: the difference between method and approach. Now, on the surface, they sound, pretty similar, don't they? Maybe even interchangeable.
Yeah, people often use them that way in casual conversation.
But the source, referencing Vernon van Dijk specifically, makes a really key distinction. What's the core difference here?
Well, it's fascinating how precise language matters, even when we're talking about how we know things. The source clarifies that method is, let's say, the more general term. It's the how. It's the procedure you follow to try and get reliable knowledge.
Okay, like the scientific method, or maybe comparing different case studies, the process.
Exactly. It's the established procedure, the tool set for gathering and analyzing information, like the scientific method or the comparative method. But an approach, according to Van Dijk, is a much broader umbrella.
Broader how?
It definitely includes the method you'll use, yes, but it dictates something more fundamental first. It dictates the focus of your study. It's the what. What do you decide is even important enough to look at?
Ah, okay.
The source quotes Van Dijk calling approaches a criteria of selection. They're basically the standards you apply to choose which political problems, which questions are worth investigating, and crucially, which bits of data are relevant to those questions and which you can, well, ignore.
Right, that's a really clear distinction. So if politics is this huge, complex landscape, the approach is like deciding which part of the landscape you're going to examine.
Yeah, exactly. Where are you going to point your telescope?
And the method is the telescope itself, the procedure you use to actually see clearly once you've picked your spot.
That's a very useful analogy, actually. And the source makes the point that a particular approach is usually, the word used is wedded, to a method that fits its focus.
Makes sense.
So, for example, the behavioral approach, which we'll get into, focuses on observable political behavior, things like voting, protesting.
Things you can actually see and count.
Right. So it naturally partners up with the scientific method because behavior is, in principle, observable, measurable, testable. On the flip side, a normative approach, which deals with values, what should be, what's just or fair, that tends to rely more on philosophical methods.
Like reasoned argument, logic.
Exactly. Logical consistency, ethical reasoning. Because you can't just go out and empirically observe justice in a test tube, can you?
No, definitely not. So the nature of what you're studying really shapes how you study it.
Precisely. And this initial distinction, method versus approach, it's so important because it immediately helps us understand why different political analysts can seem to be talking past each other.
Right.
It's not just that they prefer different research tools, different methods. It's often that they're starting from fundamentally different ideas about what aspects of politics are most important and what questions are the most critical ones to ask in the first place.
So right from the beginning, studying politics involves making these big choices about perspective and focus. It's not a neutral starting point.
Not at all. There are always assumptions baked in.
Okay, so keeping that distinction in mind, the source then lays out a kind of broad historical map, this split between traditional and contemporary approaches to political study. What's the rough timeline here? When's the dividing line?
Broadly speaking, the source suggests the traditional approaches were the main game, really, up until the end of World War II. So around 1945 is the rough marker. And the contemporary approaches, well, they really gained steam and became the preferred way for many, especially in American political science, after that period.
Right. But is traditional just a polite academic code word for old-fashioned
Yeah.
or, not really relevant anymore?
No, not at all. And the source is quite emphatic about this. It actually quotes Alan Ball saying the label traditional is neither a criticism nor a refutation.
Okay, good.
These earlier ways of studying politics, philosophical, historical, legal, institutional, they absolutely still play a vital role today. It's more that after the war, with huge global changes, new technologies, the rise of behavioral sciences, new ways of thinking emerged and became, well, dominant in many academic circles.
So it wasn't like the old ways vanish, it's just that new approaches grew up alongside them and maybe became more fashionable or seemed more suited to the new questions being asked.
Exactly. And the source also stresses these aren't, watertight compartments. There's overlap, influence back and forth.
Right.
Initially, there was this sort of simple idea floating around that the big difference was traditional equals values, contemporary equals facts.
Ah, the normative versus empirical thing again.
Right. But the source pushes back on that neat division, saying that simple view is no longer upheld. It's more complicated than that.
Oh, interesting. So the historical split, traditional versus contemporary, isn't a perfect match for the conceptual split between focusing on values versus focusing on facts.
That's a key nuance the source brings out. Now, it's true that traditional study was heavily dominated by philosophy, history, law, and studying formal institutions. That's where we get approaches named after those fields.
Makes sense.
And contemporary approaches often developed in reaction to that. They wanted to understand politics more as a dynamic process. They were really interested in observable behavior and keen to use scientific methods. The behavioral approach is kind of the poster child for this contemporary shift.
And the source mentioned that contemporary approaches also started looking outwards more, drawing on other disciplines.
Yes, absolutely. That interdisciplinary borrowing from sociology, psychology, economics, anthropology is a real hallmark of contemporary political science. It aims for a richer, more holistic picture. So this big historical divide, traditional versus contemporary, it helps set the stage for understanding the specific approaches that populated the field.
Okay, so you mentioned that the traditional contemporary split isn't purely about facts versus values, but the source does seem to spend a lot of time emphasizing that maybe the most fundamental conceptual division in political study is between empirical and normative approaches. Let's really dig into that because it seems critical.
It really is presented as a core fault line. Perhaps the core fault line.
Yeah.
Put simply, the empirical approach is concerned with what is. It tries to discover, describe, explain facts about political reality as we can observe it.
Okay, the yes.
The S. The normative approach, on the other hand, is concerned with what ought to be or what should be. It focuses on determining and prescribing values, ideals, standards for political life.
So one describes politics as it plays out. The other suggests how it should play out, or what makes for a good political system or action.
That's the general idea, yes. But, and this is crucial, the source warns us not to rely just on the words is or ought to tell them apart.
Why not? Seems straightforward.
Because language can be tricky. The real test for an empirical statement isn't just the word is, but whether it concerns a situation that is, at least in principle, observable through our senses, verifiable by repeated observation, and testable for accuracy against that observed reality.
Okay, can you give that example from the source about justice and the word is? That seemed helpful.
Right. The source uses the question, what is justice? Okay, if someone says justice is treating equals equally, or they use a more complex definition like John Rawls' idea that social arrangements are just if they benefit the least advantaged.
They're using it.
They're using is, but these are statements expressing value preferences. They're defining what justice means to them, normatively. You can't go out with a measuring tape or a microscope and empirically verify that definition of justice in the real world.
Got it. So even with is, it's really a normative claim about what justice should mean.
Exactly. Now, what about the flip side? The source says some statements using ought to can actually be empirical. That feels a bit weird, doesn't it?
Yeah, ought feels inherently value-laden.
It does, but here's the key distinction the source makes. An ought to statement qualifies as empirical if it's prescribing an action in order to achieve a specific, definite purpose or condition whose outcome is empirically testable.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
The source gives the example. Everybody ought to vote in elections in order to make democracy work. See the structure.
Yeah, ought to vote in order to make democracy work.
Right. The required action is voting. The purpose is making democracy work. Now, whether widespread voting actually does help democracy work is something you can, in principle, go out and study empirically. You can look at voter turnout data, measures of democratic health, and test that connection. The outcome is potentially observable and testable.
Ah, I see. So if the ought is instrumental, you should do X to achieve testable result Y, then it's an empirical claim about that cause and effect relationship, like you ought to stop smoking to improve your lung health. Improving lung health is testable.
Exactly. You've got it. The source stresses it's the content and verifiability, not just the grammar.
Yeah.
A truly normative ought to statement is different. It requires an action to serve an intrinsic value, something good in itself, like truth or beauty or justice itself, which isn't directly testable as an outcome.
Right. Versus the empirical ought to serving an instrumental value, a means to some other observable end. That intrinsic versus instrumental distinction is really useful for untangling these statements.
It is. It helps clarify things a lot.
Okay, so the source then dives into criticisms of each approach. The normative approach gets hit for being subjective, right? Like it's just down to personal opinion or taste.
Yes. The source mentions T.D. Weldon argued something like that political philosophy is basically stating your political taste. And you can't really argue about taste. You state it and leave it. Seems a bit dismissive.
The source strongly disagrees, calling that view biased. It argues that even when people have very different ideas about freedom or equality or justice, reasoned dialogue is possible. People can appeal to basic principles of reasoning, logic, consistency, evidence, were relevant, to support their normative claims and critique others. It's not just arbitrary whim. There's a basis for structured, rational argument about values.
So normative arguments do have structure and logic, even if they aren't empirically provable in the same way.
That's the counterargument, yes. And the empirical approach doesn't get off scot-free either. While it aims for objective truth or falsity, the source points out that even scientific knowledge is largely tentative.
Meaning it can change. Exactly. The source flatly says, nobody can claim to have found the final truth, even in science. Scientific principles hold until new evidence or a better theory comes along. So the idea of absolute final certainty isn't quite accurate, even for science.
That certainly tempers the claim of empirical study to have the final word. And the source adds that in politics, unlike maybe pure lab science, we often have to act before we have that kind of certainty anyway.
Absolutely critical point. Robert Dahl's quote, cited in the source, is powerful. In politics, refusing to decide is simply deciding to allow others to decide for you. You often can't wait for perfect scientific validation. Decisions need to be made.
Right. The source also brings up description versus prescription. Empirical is mostly descriptive, normative mainly prescriptive.
That's the general tendency, yes. Empirical study often describes things as they are, like laws of nature, gravity. Normative study often prescribes how things should be, especially concerning alterable human arrangements like laws or social structures.
But again, not a totally clean break.
No. Normative thinkers often start by describing society before prescribing changes. Plato, Aristotle. And empirical findings can lead to prescriptions if you accept a certain goal. If empirical data shows policy A reduces crime and your goal is reducing crime, that leads to an instrumental prescription. You ought to implement policy A.
And empirical findings can directly challenge normative claims, right? Like the Aristotle example about slaves.
Yes, that's a powerful illustration. Aristotle's normative justification for treating slaves differently rested partly on an empirical claim that slaves were naturally less sensitive. Modern empirical science has shown that's factually wrong. Sensitivity isn't tied to social status.
So the empirical evidence undermines the foundation of his normative argument.
Exactly. It shows how they can interact constructively or critically.
But despite this potential, the source highlights these big criticisms that tend to keep them apart. From the empirical side, it's the difficulty, maybe impossibility, of finding a scientifically valid way to determine what's morally right or wrong.
Correct. Strict behavioralists struggled with how to incorporate values into a scientific framework without compromising objectivity.
And from the normative side, the criticism is that the empirical approach, by trying to be value-free, becomes indifferent to morality, maybe even harmful.
Yes, that's where the source brings in Leo Strauss again. with that very strong quote about value-free analysis, unwittingly contributing to the victory of the gutter.
Powerful words. What was his concern?
Strauss felt that by refusing to engage with questions of good and bad, right and wrong, empirical political science was abandoning the core purpose of political inquiry, which, for him, was the pursuit of the good life and the good society. It became technically sophisticated, but morally empty.
Wow. So it's a fundamental disagreement about what political science is even for.
It really is. And the source concludes this section with a strong warning that this state of estrangement between the two can be disastrous. It calls for an urgent need to build a bridge between empirical and normative approaches.
Why? For whose benefit?
For the benefit of the discipline itself, to make it more complete, but also for its ability to contribute meaningfully to human civilization. It's a call for a more integrated understanding.
That really underscores how central this empirical normative tension is. It's not just an academic debate. It has real implications for how we understand and try to improve our political world.
It really does. Understanding whether a disagreement stems from different facts or different values is key.
Okay, let's shift focus now. Moving away from that big conceptual divide, the source takes us back to the historical, traditional approaches. It identifies 4 main pillars that were dominant before the contemporary shift: philosophical, historical, legal, and institutional. Let's look at each.
Right. These are the mainstays of political thought for a very long time, up to the mid-20th century.
Starting with the philosophical approach. The source connects this strongly to clarifying concepts.
Yes, think of the great political philosophers. Vernon van Dijk is cited again here, saying a key aim is to enhance linguistic clarity and reduce linguistic confusion. The idea is that our language shapes our understanding of reality.
So philosophers try to make sure we know what we're talking about when we use big words like freedom, justice, state, power.
Exactly. Getting the definitions clear, consistent, coherent, but it goes beyond just definitions. Van Dijk also points out it aims to develop standards of right and wrong, using reason to evaluate what currently exists, institutions, laws, policies.
So it's about figuring out what's good, right, just, and then using that as a benchmark.
Precisely. Which, as we've noted, ties it very closely to the normative approach we just discussed.
Makes sense.
The source points out that classical political theory, Plato, Aristotle, etc., is largely philosophical in this sense. They were deeply engaged in moral reasoning about the best political order, the nature of justice, the purpose of the state.
Even if some of their specific conclusions or assumptions seem problematic now, like Aristotle on slavery versus Kant on human dignity.
Right. Their empirical assumptions might be outdated, or their moral judgments might clash with modern sensibilities. But the method of reasoned argument about values is central. And they often started, as the source notes, with some idea about human nature.
Like Aristotle saying man is a political animal.
Exactly. Or Hobbes's view of human life as potentially nasty, brutish, and short without a strong state. From these starting points, they explored core questions: the art of government, how rulers should rule, like Machiavelli focused on, and the grounds of political obligation. Why should we obey the state? Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau wrestled with this.
And Locke shifted things towards individual rights against the state.
Yes, pioneering liberalism. Later thinkers like Kant, Mill, Green, Lasty built on these ideas, debating rights, liberty, equality, the proper limits of state power. More recently, Rawls revived Kantian ideas for his theory of justice. And then you have Marx offering a radical critique, linking politics to class and challenging the whole notion of obligation to the capitalist state.
So this philosophical tradition really gave us the fundamental vocabulary and the enduring questions about why we have government, what our rights are, what our duties are.
Absolutely. Concepts like rights, revolution, liberty, equality, democracy, authority, they all emerge from this deep philosophical debate. And the source again mentions Leo Strauss as a contemporary champion, equating political science with political philosophy, seeking true knowledge of politics, including values, and strongly criticizing value-free approaches.
Okay, moving to the historical approach. The source mentions 2 different senses of this.
Yes. The first is what's called historicism. This is the attempt to find grand laws or inevitable patterns in history that dictate political development. Thinkers like Hegel or Marx are sometimes seen as doing this,
Trying to predict the future from the past.
and arguing that future is predetermined by historical forces. Karl Popper was a major critic of this, arguing it denies human agency and could be used to justify forcing society towards a supposedly inevitable future, potentially using totalitarian means.
Okay, so that's one sense. What's the other?
The second, and probably more common understanding, is using history to understand politics by studying the history of political thought. George Savine's famous textbook is the prime example here.
So this means reading Plato, Machiavelli, Locke, Marx, etc., to understand the ideas that shape politics today.
Precisely. Sabine argued that the core themes of political science are the themes debated by these great thinkers throughout history. He stressed understanding the historical context in which an idea arose is crucial to grasping its meaning.
But he also thought these ideas had lasting value.
Yes, he believed the greatest theories offered insights relevant for all times.
What did the critics say about relying so much on old ideas?
Well, they argued firstly that it's hard to truly grasp past ideas using our modern concepts,
Yeah.
and secondly, that past thinkers couldn't possibly have foreseen today's crises, so their ideas might not be adequate guides. David Easton's famous warning against political science living parasitically on ideas a century old comes from this critique.
So the feeling was it wasn't focused enough on the present.
Yes, and that it wasn't scientific enough. This critique was actually a major spur for the development of the behavioral approach, which wanted to be more empirical and contemporary.
But the historical approach isn't dead, is it?
Not at all. The source notes that the renewed interest in values and normative questions has brought historical thought back into focus. When contemporary theorists like Rawls engage deeply with Locke and Kant, or others reinterpret Marx or Aristotle for today's world, they show the enduring relevance of this approach.
Okay, next pillar. The legal approach. This seems fairly straightforward, studying politics by looking at the law.
It does what it says on the tin, really. It concentrates on the legal and constitutional framework. How do government bodies function according to the law? What are their legal powers, their procedures, the basis for their legal validity?
So analyzing the Indian Constitution or Supreme Court rulings or parliamentary procedures in the UK.
Exactly, or international treaties and organizations in international politics. It's about the formal rules of the game.
Looking at the rule book.
Essentially. Now, its obvious limitation is that it often misses the political dynamics that happen outside or around this formal legal rules, lobbying, public opinion, social movements, power plays.
Things that aren't in the statute book.
Right. But the source quotes Van Dyke again, cautioning that it shouldn't be disparaged. Legal rules and procedures do profoundly shape political action and outcomes.
And political changes often become stable and effective precisely because they get enshrined in law, right?
That's a key point. Think about the civil rights movement. A lot of its long-term impact came from changing laws. Constitutional law, administrative law, international law. These are still absolutely central to understanding how political systems operate and constrain actors. But yes, its weakness is overlooking the informal and the non-legal.
Which brings us neatly to the fourth traditional pillar, the institutional approach. The source says this is related to the legal one but distinct, and it's the one that really gave political study its own identity among these traditional fields.
Yes, this approach essentially defined the core subject matter of political science as the study of the state and government institutions. It focuses on the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, the bureaucracy, and often political parties, not just through a legal lens, but examining their structure, roles, and functions as key components of the political system.
So what exactly makes something an institution in this view?
The classic definition, mentioned in the source, is a set of offices and agencies, often arranged hierarchically, with specific functions and powers, staffed by people with defined roles. Think parliament, or the presidency, or a government department.
Formal structures.
Yes. But the source also includes Van Dyke's broader definition. Quote, any persistent system of activities and expectations, or any stable pattern of group behavior.
Oh, that's much wider. What could that include?
Potentially things like the established patterns of voting in elections, or regularized lobbying practices, or even the functioning of established media outlets as political actors. It's about stable, predictable patterns of political interaction, often centered around formal or informal bodies.
Okay, so this approach studies how these structures are organized, how they work, maybe compares different types of legislatures or executive branches.
Right. Classifying governments, identifying different levels and branches, analyzing their powers and how they relate to each other, often using legal terms, but also looking at their actual functioning. It aims for detailed description of these structures.
So more empirical and focused on the present day than, say, the historical approach.
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
More descriptive of current facts and structures, but it had some significant drawbacks, according to the source.
Who are they?
Several big ones. Because it focused so much on the structures, it tended to neglect the individual citizen voting behavior, political psychology, that was often left to sociologists. It struggled with international politics because there wasn't a single clear world government with neat institutions to study. And perhaps most importantly, because it focused on established institutions, it had trouble analyzing things that happen outside or against those institutions. Informal power networks, social movements, political violence, protests, war, revolution, things that disrupt the institutional order.
That's a pretty major blind spot. If you only study the formal rules and bodies, you miss a lot of actual politics.
You do. But, that said, institutions are still undeniably crucial. The source concludes this part by saying any political analysis that ignores institutions will lead us nowhere.
Especially in places trying to build stable democracies.
Exactly. Constitution making, institution building, these are central political tasks. So the takeaway is the institutional approach alone is insufficient, but no other approach can be complete if it completely ignores the institutional framework.
So, summing up the traditional approaches, they gave us the big questions: philosophy, the long view, history, the rules of the game, legal, and the map of the formal structures, institutional. But their limitations, especially in capturing dynamic behavior and informal politics, really paved the way for new approaches after World War II.
Precisely. They laid foundations but also left gaps that spurred innovation.
And that brings us squarely into the era of contemporary approaches, kicking off mainly after WWII. The source highlights two key motivations. One, establishing political science as a distinct, more, scientific discipline, and two, trying to grasp politics in totality, looking beyond just the formal state institutions.
Yes, the ambition was to get at the real character of politics, understanding how it's embedded in and influenced by broader social life. The source flags the behavioral approach as the most important shift, followed by its evolution into post-behavioralism and various analytical models that grew out of this empirical turn.
Let's tackle behavioralism first. The source calls it the typical contemporary approach. Where did it come from?
While it really exploded in American political science after the war, the source traces its roots back earlier. Figures like Graham Wallas and Arthur Bentley, way back in 1908, were already arguing against just studying constitutions and formal structures.
What did they want to study instead?
Wallas, using insights from psychology, challenged the old idea of a purely rational political actor. He said we need to study how people actually behave in politics, considering emotions and unconscious factors. Bentley focused almost entirely on informal groups and their interactions as the real stuff of politics, developing tools to study them and famously having little time for formal institutions.
So even back then, there was a push away from abstract structures towards real people and groups acting politically.
Exactly. Then Charles E. Merriam in the Chicago School in the 1920s and 30s really pushed this further. Merriam criticized the lack of scientific rigor and interdisciplinary work in political science. He calls for a policy science using quantitative methods and explicitly urged scholars to focus on political behavior as one of the essential objects of inquiry.
He sounds like a real driving force for making the field more scientific and relevant.
He was. Although the source notes there was debate even then. Merriam wanted science to serve democratic values, while others, like William B. Monroe, disagreed, pushing for more neutrality. G.E.G. Catlin argued strongly for a completely value-free political science focused on power as its core concept.
Which connects to Harold Lasswell's famous definition of politics.
Right. Politics, who gets what, when, how. That focus on power and distribution, studied scientifically, was building.
So the groundwork was laid before WWII.
Yes, but the full systematic development of behavioralism as a dominant movement, with key figures like David Truman, Robert Dahl, Everett Kirkpatrick, and David Easton writing foundational works and setting the agenda, really happened after the war.
And how did they actually define political behavior? What were they looking at?
Jeffrey K. Roberts, cited in the source, gives a good definition. It's those aspects of human behavior that take place within political contexts. The focus is primarily on the individual, the voter, the leader, the revolutionary, the party member, but importantly, also considering how their behavior is shaped by the groups they belong to, the political system they're in, and the broader political culture.
So it's studying individual actions, but not in isolation, understanding the person in their political environment.
Exactly. It's about understanding why the voter votes a certain way, why a leader makes a certain decision, how someone becomes an activist, and it looks at the underlying processes. Political socialization, how we learn our political beliefs, the role of ideology and culture, political participation, communication, leadership styles, decision-making processes, even political violence, all viewed through the lens of behavior.
And this obviously required borrowing from other fields.
Hugely. Psychology, sociology, anthropology were essential for providing theories and methods to study these behaviors.
Now, the source outlines David Easton's famous 8 intellectual foundations, or tenets of behavioralism. These really sound like the commandments for this new scientific approach. Can we run through those?
Yes, they became incredibly influential, kind of a benchmark for what rigorous political inquiry should look like. Let's list them out. 1, regularities. The belief that you can find discoverable patterns, uniformities in political behavior. These regularities allow you to build theories that could explain and even predict political actions.
Okay, find the patterns.
2, verification. This is key. Any theory or explanation must be testable against observable behavior. Claims have to be subject to empirical validation.
Testability, got it.
3, techniques. A self-conscious focus on methods. You need sophisticated, rigorous techniques for observing, recording, and analyzing behavior. You need to be explicit about your methods.
Rigorous methods.
4, quantification. Where possible, measure things. Use numbers, statistics. Precision requires measurement and quantitative data, not just descriptive accounts.
Measure.
5, values. This is a big one. A sharp distinction between ethical evaluation, values, what should be, and empirical explanation, facts, what is. The goal was objective, value-free, or value-neutral inquiry. Keep your opinions out of the science.
Separate facts and values.
6, systematization. Theory and research must be closely linked. Research guided by theory is meaningful. Theory tested against data is robust. They shouldn't be separate activities.
Theory and research together.
7, pure science. The primary goal is understanding and explaining political behavior for its own sake. Applying that knowledge to solve practical problems comes after you have a solid scientific understanding. First understand, then apply.
Science first, application later.
8, integration. Political science shouldn't be an island. It needs to connect with and draw upon other social sciences, sociology, psychology, economics, for a more complete understanding of human behavior, which is complex and multifaceted.
Integrate with other sciences. Wow, that is a comprehensive vision for a science of politics.
It really was. A clear attempt to make political science more rigorous, more empirical, more like the natural sciences in its approach.
And the source notes, this often led to a focus on reliability over generality, focusing on smaller questions you could answer definitively.
Yes, because the emphasis was on verifiable findings using available methods. This often meant focusing on micro-level phenomena like individual voting decisions in one election, or the behavior of small committees where data could be reliably collected and analyzed, rather than tackling huge, complex historical questions where verification is much harder. Van Dyck's example, a strict behavioralist wouldn't ask what caused the fall of Rome.
Because you can't easily observe and verify that behaviorally.
Exactly. It's too broad, too complex for their preferred methods.
But this very strict focus on pure science, often at the micro level, and the insistence on being value-free eventually led to a reaction, didn't it? The post-behavioral revolution.
It did. By the mid to late 1960s, criticisms were becoming louder. We already mentioned Leo Strauss arguing that ignoring normative questions led to a crisis in political theory. Sheldon Wolin felt the obsession with method meant political science was losing its way, abdicating its responsibility to address significant political problems.
And events in the real world probably played a role.
Hugely. The Vietnam War, civil rights struggles, urban riots, the nuclear threat, the world seemed full of urgent crises. And critics felt behavioralism, in its quest for scientific purity, was fiddling while Rome burned, so to speak. It seemed detached, irrelevant. Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions also suggested that science progresses by solving important problems, not just refining methods.
So the feeling grew that behavioralism, for all its rigor, was becoming sterile, lost in its own techniques.
That was the charge. And then, quite remarkably, in 1969, David Easton himself, a pioneer of behavioralism, announced what he called the post-behavioral revolution.
Wow, the founder calling for a revolution against his own movement.
Well, not quite against it. He framed it more as building upon behavioralism. It wasn't about discarding the commitment to rigorous systematic research, but about making that research relevant and applying it to pressing social and political problems. It was about bringing values back into the picture.
And the catchphrases were relevance and action.
Exactly. Easton lamented the ivory tower mentality. He argued that intellectuals have a crucial role in protecting humane values and helping to reshape society. He insisted that scientists can engage with values, analyzing them, clarifying choices, assessing consequences without abandoning scientific objectivity.
So post-behavioralism wasn't throwing out the scientific toolkit, but redirecting it, using those rigorous methods to tackle real-world issues and acknowledging the importance of values in that process.
Precisely. It sought to reintegrate the concern for values within the behavioral framework, not reject the framework itself.
Yeah.
And the source suggests that, largely, contemporary social sciences absorbed this. The emphasis on applying knowledge to solve problems is now pretty mainstream.
The source has a table summarizing the differences, which seems useful.
Yes, just to hit the highlights. Behavioralism aimed for pure knowledge, was micro-level focused, interested in the process of politics, how decisions are made, aimed to be value-neutral, and tended towards analyzing the status quo.
Okay. And post-behavioralism.
Post-behavioralism, aimed for applied knowledge and practice, was motivated by relevance and action for problem-solving, more macro-level focused, interested in the content and substance of political decisions, concerned with the choice of values and their implications, and more interested in social change.
That distinction really clarifies the shift in priorities and focus.
Oh, yeah.
And flowing out of this whole empirical scientific orientation, both behavioral and post-behavioral, the source discusses several specific models of political analysis. What are these?
These are conceptual frameworks designed to help analyze the political process, especially since politics came to be widely seen as a dynamic process of interaction rather than just static institutions. They provide structured ways to identify key variables, organize data, and explain political phenomena. Easton's definition of politics as the authoritative allocation of values is itself a kind of conceptual starting point for building such models.
So they're like blueprints or maps for understanding how the political machine works.
Exactly, conceptual models. The source highlights several important ones, mostly stemming from the liberal democratic tradition: systems analysis, structural functional analysis, communication theory, and decision-making analysis. And it also treats Marxian analysis as a distinct model, offering a very different perspective.
Okay, let's unpack these models, starting with systems analysis. The source calls David Easton the pioneer here.
Yes, Easton applied general systems theory to politics. The basic idea is to think of politics as a political system. And a system, as Robert Dahl put it simply, is just any collection of elements that interact in some way with one another.
So like the different parts of an engine working together.
Sort of, but in politics, the elements are more abstract roles, actions, processes interacting within the political sphere, not just specific people or buildings.
And how does Easton's model depict the system working based on his authoritative allocation of values idea?
He sees the political system as open, meaning it interacts constantly with its environment, basically, the rest of society, economic, social, cultural spheres. The system receives inputs from this environment.
Inputs, like what?
Two main types: demands and supports. Demands are what people and groups want from the system, things like better wages, roads, schools, regulations on business, the right to vote, protection, etc.
Okay, the asks.
And supports. Supports are what the environment provides to the system to keep it going and give it legitimacy, things like paying taxes, obeying laws, participating in elections, showing respect for institutions and symbols.
Got it. Demands come in, supports keep it stable. What does the system do with them?
The system acts like a conversion machine. It processes these inputs and generates outputs. Outputs are basically authoritative decisions and policies, laws, regulations, resource allocations, symbolic actions.
And these outputs go back into the environment.
Exactly. And this is crucial. There's a feedback loop. Information about the effects of the outputs and the state of the environment flows back into the system.
And this feedback influences future demands and supports. Like, if a policy works well, support might increase. If it fails, demands might change.
Precisely. It's a continuous cycle. Feedback allows the system to monitor its performance, adapt to changing conditions, and adjust its actions to try and maintain stability or achieve its goals. Easton detailed different types of demands, supports, and outputs. The key goal for the system is maintaining equilibrium or persistence.
What happens if it gets overwhelmed? Too many demands, not enough support.
That causes stress on the system. The model includes regulatory mechanisms to cope with stress. Things like political parties or interest groups acting as gatekeepers to filter or aggregate demands. Cultural norms limiting what gets demanded. Better communication channels. Government bodies processing demands.
So what if the stress is too much?
If stress persists and reaches a critical point, the model suggests it can lead to major changes. The authorities might be replaced, the whole regime might change, like in a revolution, or the political system itself could collapse.
So it models both stability and potential breakdown. The source says it's useful for comparing different countries' political systems.
Yes, because it provides a common framework, inputs, outputs, feedback, environment that can be applied across different contexts, even internationally. Its weakness, some critics argue, is that it's quite abstract and doesn't always capture the nuances of power struggles or individual motivations very well.
Okay, next model. Structural functional analysis. This also uses the system idea but focuses on functions, and it's big in comparative politics.
Yes, developed by Gabriel Almond and colleagues, drawing heavily on sociology and anthropology. It became very popular for comparing political systems, especially across different cultures and levels of development.
Why was it so good for comparison?
Because it argues that while political structures like legislatures, parties, bureaucracies might look very different across countries, all political systems, in order to survive, must perform certain essential functions. It provides a standard checklist of functions to look for in any system.
What are these universal functions?
Arman and Coleman identified some key characteristics first. All systems have structures. The same functions are performed in all systems, even if by different structures. Structures are often multifunctional. For example, a legislature might also socialize citizens. And systems are culturally mixed, blend of modern and traditional elements.
And then Almond and Powell refined this, linking specific functions to inputs and outputs.
Right. They argued that to survive, systems need to perform a set of functional requirements. They mapped Easton's input-output idea onto specific functions and identified the typical structures that perform them, recognizing that in some systems, these structures might be less specialized or formal.
Okay, let's list those functions. 4 input functions.
Right. The input functions are about how society interacts with the political system. 1, political socialization and recruitment. How individuals acquire political beliefs and values and how they are brought into political roles. Structures involved. Family, schools, peer groups, media.
How people learn politics.
2, interest articulation. How individuals and groups express their needs and demands to the political system. Structure, often interest groups, protest movements.
Voicing demands.
3, interest aggregation. How the many diverse demands are combined, prioritized, and converted into concrete policy proposals or political platforms. Structure, typically political parties.
Packaging demands.
4, political communication. The flows information throughout the political system and between the system and society, mass media, but also informal networks.
Information flow. Okay, and 3 output functions. These sound more like government actions.
They are. These correspond roughly to the traditional branches of government.
The process of formulating and enacting laws and authoritative policies. Structure, usually legislatures.
Banking laws.
6, rule application. Implementing and enforcing the laws and policies. Structure, executive branch, bureaucracy, police.
Applying laws.
7, rule adjudication. Interpreting laws and settling disputes about them.
Judging laws. So this model maps the journey from societal demands to government actions by identifying these key functions and the structures that perform them.
Exactly. And Ullman used this framework to define political development. A system was considered more developed based on 2 main criteria.
Which were?
A, structural differentiation. How specialized are the structures performing these functions? Do you have distinct legislatures, parties, courts, interest groups? Or are these functions performed by more generalized structures, like a tribal council or a king's court? More specialization equals more development.
Okay. And B.
Secularization of culture. To what extent are political attitudes and decision-making based on rational, empirical considerations versus traditional beliefs, religion, or custom? A more secularized political culture involves evaluating policies based on evidence and expected outcomes.
So a more developed system, in this view, has specialized bodies doing specific jobs, and decisions are made more rationally.
That's the general idea. It allowed for comparing, say, a modern Western democracy with a newly independent developing nation by looking at how these functions were performed and by what kinds of structures.
What were the criticisms? The source mentioned conservatism and being Western-centric.
Yes. Critics argued that because it focuses on the functions needed for system survival or maintenance, it has an inherent conservative bias, downplaying conflict and radical change. It was also heavily criticized for appearing to use the Western liberal democratic model, with its high degree of structural differentiation and secular culture, as the universal endpoint or standard of development, potentially devaluing other political forms.
So, judging others by Western standards.
That was the accusation. Despite these criticisms, its systematic approach to comparison was seen as a major advance at the time.
Okay, moving on to communications theory.
Mhm.
Carl Deutsch is the main figure here, and he brought in ideas from cybernetics, information technology.
Yes, Deutsch took inspiration from cybernetics, the science of control and communication in machines and living organisms, and applied it to politics. He suggested looking at government not just as wielding power, but as a system that steers itself and society through communication. He saw the political system primarily as a network of communication channels.
So communication is absolutely central. How does studying the flow of information help understand politics?
The idea is that by analyzing how information flows into, through, and out of the political system, you can describe and explain political life. The system is seen as self-regulating, needing mechanisms to acquire, store, process, and transmit information effectively to achieve its goals and adapt to its environment.
Like a thermostat, receiving information about temperature and adjusting the heating.
That's the cybernetic analogy, yes. Davies and Lewis, cited in the source, emphasize that the system's coherence and ability to adapt depend crucially on these communication processes working properly, receiving feedback, processing it accurately, adjusting course.
And the source breaks down different aspects of communication to study.
Yes, you can analyze the structures involved, who sends, who receives, the channels, their capacity, any delays or distortions, information storage, memory, feedback loops, the codes and languages used, and the content of the messages themselves. A key practical challenge is detecting distortions in communication.
James Charlesworth highlighted that, the gap between sending and receiving.
Yes, he stressed the importance of distinguishing the message the source intended versus what the recipient actually understood. Miscommunication is a major political problem.
And Charlesworth even floated the idea that improving political communication could help solve real-world conflicts, like strikes or riots.
He did suggest that as a potential application, though he acknowledged the theory wasn't fully developed or standardized, it's seen as particularly useful for analyzing specific political processes where information and signaling are key things like bargaining, negotiation, conflict resolution, policy evaluation, propaganda and public relations, and international diplomacy.
But it has limitations, too. The source says it's not great for analyzing things like power structures, ideology, or revolution.
Right. Its strength is in analyzing the flow and processing of information. It's very useful when that's the core dynamic. But it struggles to capture the raw struggles over power, fundamental ideological clashes, or the dynamics of violence and social upheaval, which aren't easily reducible to communication problems. So, useful, but in a more limited sphere.
Okay, and the final model in this group, decision-making analysis. This seems to zoom right in on a key output of the political system, the decisions themselves.
Exactly. It views the political process primarily as a sequence of arriving at decisions, particularly public decisions that are binding on society. It acknowledges decisions happen everywhere, families, businesses, but focuses on the political arena.
So who makes decisions, and why do they make the ones they do?
That's the core question. Van Dyke points out the wide range of decision makers. Political parties choosing candidates, voters deciding who to support, legislators voting on bills, executives issuing orders, judges making rulings.
And how does the analysis work? What does it look at?
It typically involves identifying the specific issue requiring a decision, pinpointing the key actors and structures involved, sometimes even looking at the psychology or personality of individual decision makers, mapping out the alternative options considered, analyzing the factors influencing the choice, like the decision maker's preferences, values, perceptions of costs and benefits, considering external pressures, and assessing the political context and consequences of the final decision.
And it often assumes rationality, that decision makers are trying to calculate the best way to reach their goals.
Yes, there's often an underlying assumption of rational calculation, seeking efficient means to desired ends, like in economic models. But the approach also investigates departures from pure rationality, looking at things like bureaucratic routines, standard operating procedures,
Right.
cognitive biases, emotional responses, or ideological commitments that might lead to seemingly irrational choices, drawing on social psychology.
And the source mentions different types of decision-making models.
Yes. Models that break down the decision process into stages or variables, like those by Snyder or Lasswell, Models using economic analogies where actors are assumed to maximize their advantage, like Downs on voting or Buchanan and Tullock on public choice, and the application of game theory, which mathematically models strategic interactions in competitive or bargaining situations, again, usually assuming rational actors.
This sounds incredibly interdisciplinary. Psychology, sociology, economics, administrative theory, all feeding in.
It really is. The ultimate goal for some proponents was to contribute to a general theory of human decision-making. While the source notes that grand theory hasn't fully materialized, the approach itself is very versatile. It can be applied to analyze decisions at any level, from local government to international summits involving all sorts of political actors.
So these contemporary model systems, structural functional, communications, decision-making, they give us these structured, often empirically focused ways to analyze politics as a set of dynamic processes, looking at behavior, system interactions, information flows, or specific choice points. They offer toolkits for dissecting the how and why of political life.
That's a good summary. They represent the effort to make political analysis more systematic and, in many ways, more scientific.
Now, the source sets Marxian analysis somewhat apart from these other contemporary models. It notes that politics figures only incidentally for classical Marxism and calls it political analysis by proxy. Why such a different framing?
Because, as the source quotes Alex Kalinikos, classical Marxism fundamentally challenges the idea of politics as a permanent or independent sphere of life. It denies politics is a persisting feature of all societies, argues it can't be studied meaningfully in isolation from its economic roots, and ultimately seeks its abolition. This is obviously radically different from approaches that assume politics is a distinct field of study.
So why does Marxism view politics as secondary or temporary?
It boils down to the core Marxist concept of the base and superstructure. The source uses a helpful building metaphor. The real foundation, the base, is the economic structure of society, the mode of production, the technology, the resources, and the relations of production, essentially the class structure, who owns what, who works for whom.
Okay, the economy is the base.
Right. And the superstructure consists of everything built upon that base: the legal system, the political system, the state, religion, morality, culture, ideology. The crucial point is that the superstructure is seen as being conditioned or determined by the economic base.
So the way society produces goods shapes its politics, laws, and ideas.
That's the classical Marxist argument, yes. Marx himself is quoted saying the mode of production conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. If the political system isn't independent, if it's just a reflection of the economic base, then studying it in isolation doesn't tell you much about the fundamental forces at play.
So instead of analyzing governments or voting, you analyze the economy.
You analyze the economic structure, yes. Specifically, the historical stage of development, feudalism, capitalism, etc., and the resulting class structure, the relations of production. Society, in this view, is fundamentally divided into antagonistic classes based on ownership of the means of production.
Like capitalists and workers under capitalism.
Exactly. The dominant class owns the means of production. The dependent class has only their labor to sell. Class conflict is seen as inevitable as long as private property and exploitation exist.
And politics, then, is just the expression of this underlying class conflict.
Fundamentally, yes. Political power, as Marx and Engels famously wrote in the Communist Manifesto, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. Politics is the arena where classes fight for control or influence over the state, which itself is seen as an instrument of the dominant class. Under capitalism, politics is basically the struggle between the capitalist class trying to maintain its rule and the working class organizing to overthrow it.
The source lists the historical stages Marxism identifies.
Right. Primitive communism, supposedly classless; slave system, master slaves; feudal system, lord serfs; capitalist system, capitalist workers. The predicted next stage is the socialist system, where the working class takes power.
And the ultimate goal is communism.
Yes, the idea is that genuine socialism, by establishing common ownership of the means of production, will abolish classes entirely. Once classes disappear, the state as an instrument of class rule will become redundant and wither away, leading eventually to communism. A classless, stateless society where, theoretically, administration remains but coercive political power vanishes.
So for a classical Marxist, comparing, say, the U.S. political system to the Prussian system in Marx's time wasn't about republic versus monarchy.
No, the source uses that example. Marx argued that despite their different political forms, both were built on a capitalist economic base, so fundamentally their political systems serve the same function. upholding capitalist class rule. The political form was secondary, superficial. In this view, there's limited scope for independent political analysis. You have to analyze the economics.
But the source says neo-Marxists modified this. They saw a more active role for politics.
Yes, later Marxist thinkers, often called neo-Marxists, realized that the superstructure, particularly the state and ideology, wasn't always just a passive reflection of the base. It could be relatively autonomous and actively work to strengthen and reproduce the economic base. This meant the political and ideological realms did require independent analysis.
And Antonio Gramsci is a key figure here.
Absolutely. Gramsci developed influential concepts for analyzing how the bourgeois state, the state under capitalism, maintains its power not just through force but through consent. He looked at its structures of domination.
Structures of domination. How did he break that down?
Gramsci distinguished between political society, the realm of direct domination, coercion, force, think the government, police, army, legal system, and civil society, the realm of indirect rule, consent, persuasion, generating legitimacy, think family, schools, churches, trade unions, mass media.
And hegemony fits in here. That's about consent generated in civil society.
Exactly. Hegemony is the process by which the ruling class disseminates its values and beliefs throughout civil society, making its rule seem natural, legitimate, and common sense, thus gaining the active consent of the governed. Gramsci argued capitalist states rely heavily on hegemony generated in civil society, resorting to direct coercion, political society, only when consent breaks down. Ralph Miliband's work analyzing the capitalist state also fits within this neo-Marxist framework of looking at both coercion and consent.
So Marxian analysis, especially in its neo-Marxist forms, offers this fundamentally critical perspective. It roots politics in economic structures and class conflict, and it forces us to constantly ask questions about power, inequality, and whose interests the political system really serves, questions that some other models might downplay or overlook.
It provides a very different and often challenging lens on political reality, absolutely focused on power and conflict rooted in the economic system.
Wow, okay. We have journeyed through an incredible amount of territory today, from defining the basic terms method and approach, through the big historical divide, the fundamental empirical versus normative split, exploring those traditional pillars, philosophical, historical, legal, institutional, and then plunging into the contemporary world of behavioralism, post-behavioralism, and all those analytical models, systems, structural, functional, communications, decision-making, and finally grappling with the unique critique offered by Marxian analysis. My head is spinning slightly.
It is a lot to cover, definitely. We've seen approaches focused on ideals and values, on historical context, on formal rules, on structures, on individual behavior, on system dynamics, on necessary functions, on information flows, on decision processes, and on underlying economic power. Each offers a distinct way into understanding politics.
But let's bring it back home, as we promised. Why should someone listening right now, trying to make sense of today's chaotic political world, care about all these different academic ways of slicing the pie? How does this help you?
Well, because as we've hinted all along, every political argument you encounter, every news report, every pundit's take, it's not coming out of thin air. It's consciously or unconsciously drawing on one or more of these underlying approaches. It's using a particular lens.
So if someone's analysis is all about polling data and voter demographics,
they're likely using a behavioral lens.
if the debate revolves around constitutional interpretation or the powers of the Supreme Court,
That's drawing heavily on legal and institutional approaches.
if the argument is passionately about fairness, rights, or what constitutes a just society,
That's rooted in the philosophical and normative tradition.
if an expert explains international relations using terms like inputs, outputs, feedback,
They're applying a systems model.
and if someone argues that fundamentally political conflicts are driven by the clash between the rich and the poor, the owners and the workers.
That's almost certainly coming from a Marxian or neo-Marxian perspective. Recognizing the approach helps you decode the argument.
So understanding the approach helps you see what they're focusing on, what questions they think are most important, and what kind of evidence they value. It's like seeing the analyst's assumptions.
Exactly. And just as importantly, it helps you see what they might be missing or downplaying. Every lens highlights certain things, but inevitably leaves other things in the shadows or out of focus.
Right. An analysis focused purely on institutions might miss the power of a social movement. An analysis focused purely on behavior might miss the deep historical roots of a conflict.
Precisely. And if you only hear analyses coming from one perspective, you get a very incomplete picture.
So it helps you ask better questions yourself.
Yeah.
Like, okay, This analysis focuses on X, but what about Y? What lens would help me understand Y?
Absolutely. It empowers you to be a more critical consumer of political information. No single approach holds the ultimate key to understanding everything about politics. Remember the source calling for a bridge between empirical and normative. That reflects the understanding that different approaches capture different vital aspects of a very complex reality.
So by understanding these different ways scholars study politics, you gain a richer, more nuanced, more critical perspective yourself. It helps explain why experts disagree, and it equips you to navigate that disagreement with more insight.
It helps you see the why behind the different conclusions people reach.
It really is a shortcut, not just to knowing more about politics, but to understanding how we know, or claim to know, things about politics in the first place.
So wrapping up our deep dive today, we've seen that studying politics isn't a single straightforward path. It's a landscape filled with diverse lines of inquiry, each with its own unique focus, its own tools, its own valuable insights, and its own limitations.
From ancient philosophers asking about the good life and the just city, to modern social scientists meticulously analyzing behavior and modeling systems, right through to critical theories challenging the very foundations of political power.
Each approach, each lens, reveals something important about the complex, often messy, always fascinating world of politics, and having a sense of these different lenses empowers your own analysis and understanding.
So here's a final thought to take away and mull over until our next deep dive. When you think about the major political challenges confronting us today, maybe climate change, maybe rising inequality, maybe democratic backsliding, maybe geopolitical tensions, which of the approaches we've discussed do you feel is most urgently needed right now to help us understand and tackle these problems effectively? And on the flip side, which valuable approach do you think is perhaps too often neglected or pushed aside in our current public conversations about politics? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the lenses of political study. We hope you're walking away feeling a bit more equipped to view the political world with greater clarity and critique.
Until next time.